Hello, welcome to this Christmas Carol revision session. This session focuses on the Cratchits. Let's start with the surname Cratchit. Unlike Ebenezer Scrooge, where we have some concrete origins to our protagonist's name, the surname Cratchit is a little bit more ambiguous in its meaning. Dickens may well have alighted on the surname because of the way the word sounds when said aloud, an unpleasant sort of sounding surname, fitting for a family cursed by the hardships of poverty. Other scholars have explored the link the name has to the French word criquet, meaning feeble horse or person. Arguably, quite appropriate for at least one member of the family. The name might also have roots in the dialectical cratch, a version of crutch, something we know Tiny Tim is reliant upon. Another possible origin comes in the cratch connected to a manger, more specifically the nativity manger. Knowing there are Christian morals to the novel, this etymology seems plausible, linking the Cratchit family to the teachings of love and charity that run throughout the New Testament. Now, in the first stave, we meet Bob Cratchit, the father of the Cratchit family, and we meet Bob working in a dismal little cell. Now, this isn't a particularly pleasant way of describing an office. Cell, of course, has connotations of prison and punishment. Perhaps Dickens is suggesting that working for Scrooge is more like being in prison, is more like being punished for a crime than it is an opportunity to work and earn money to look after your family. The fact that we've got that adjective dismal, also very telling of the working conditions. This is not a happy place of work, and it's even a little cell. Very, very limited space is given to the people who work for Scrooge. Dickens then goes on to tell us that Scrooge has a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. Now, we know that this novel is set at Christmas, and Christmas is very cold, it's very bitter. We're lucky today in that we've got central heating, we've got radiators, we've got the ability to warm our homes, our places of work, our schools with relative ease. But for Bob in his dismal little cell, this is a painfully cold place to work. One coal on the fire is going to give very limited heat and warmth to the extent that it's almost pointless to have. It's almost a futile attempt at warming a room. So this is a very, very sad situation. And in that first stave, we see Scrooge very reluctantly allowing Bob Cratchit to have the day off, Christmas Day, so he can spend time with his family. He demands that Cratchit is in all the more early the next day to make up for lost time. And then Dickens takes a little moment to describe Cratchit on his way home to his family at the end of his working day. And Dickens describes how Cratchit ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt to play at blind man's buff. Here is a man who spends his working days in misery, and his home life is quite the antithesis, it's quite the opposite. Cratchit could not be more excited to get home. He stops and he plays on some slides as he goes, but pelt is the verb that Dickens chooses there. There is an urgency, there is an excitement, there is a desperation to get home. So right from the very beginning of this novel, we are given the sense that the Cratchit family is going to be a symbol of family, of love, of home and security. The Cratchits don't appear in stave 2, so it's not until stave 3 and the Ghost of Christmas Present that we see Bob and his family again. And it's the family that we meet first this time. We meet Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons. And this instantly is Dickens' way of telling us just how impoverished the Cratchit family are. This is not a new dress for Christmas. This is a very worn dress. It's been repaired several times. Yet nevertheless, Mrs. Cratchit is making the best of it by decorating it with ribbons. And she's not going to let an old dress wear her down. We then start to see a little bit of family life as they prepare for Christmas. Mrs. Cratchit laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda. Belinda being very helpful around the house. She brings the plates in from the kitchen and helps set the table and clear the table. Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of the potatoes. So Peter, the eldest son, is involved in preparing this feast. We see a real enthusiasm there with the verb plunged, almost as if Dickens is hyperbolizing just how plentiful this saucepan of potatoes is, when of course in reality we know that the Cratchits are very poor, we know that they have very little, and yet they're still making the best of the situation. And making the best of the situation inevitably extends to the love and the affection that they show each other. When Martha comes in from a very, very long stretch at work, her mother is seen to be kissing her a dozen times and taking off her shawl with officious zeal. Mrs. Cratchit is delighted to see her daughter home for Christmas. She kisses her over and over again. The affection that we see with this family is there in abundance. This is a family of love and of kindness. Mrs. Cratchit takes off her daughter's shawl really, really eagerly. There's huge enthusiasm to welcome her daughter home and make sure that she's embedded within the Christmas celebrations. Against this joy and this love, we have Tiny Tim, one of the Cratchit children, who's very ill. And Tim and Bob, his father, have been to church, and upon returning, Tiny Tim says he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. There's no suggestion of resentment from Tim here, that he is ill, that he's frail, that life is more of a struggle for him than his siblings. There's no anger, there's no bitterness. There's simply a sense of charity and love. Tiny Tim hopes that his appearance in church has helped to remind people of Jesus. The selflessness that we see from Tiny Tim hugely juxtaposes the selfishness we see in Scrooge in the early parts of this novel. And that joy and that abundance and that selflessness, love, comes through time and time again in this section of the novel with the Cratchits. Dinner is served. There was never such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there was ever such a goose cooked. Bob is so desperate to show gratitude to his wife for making the best of a poor, meagre feast. There's hyperbole that Dickens uses, but that hyperbole is full of love and appreciation. And that love and appreciation isn't just for food and for nourishment and for things, it's for each other. Sitting round at Christmas, we see the scene of Bob holding Tim's withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side and dreaded that he might be taken from him. Bob is very worried that his son is going to die in childhood, as was all too sadly common in this period of history. And he is desperate to hold on to his son for as long as possible. He is precious to him. This is a family built on love. And we see that tenfold with the way that Bob views Tiny Tim, his perhaps most helpless child. In spite of the poverty, in spite of the hardships the Cratchits face, in spite of the terrible treatment that Bob receives at work, Bob's gratitude extends far beyond his family. It extends right up to Scrooge, his unpleasant taskmaster of a boss. Raising his glass, Bob exclaims, "Mr. Scrooge, I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." Such is Bob Cratchit's heart, such is his awareness, his ability to engage with charity, that even though Bob should be in receipt of charity to support his family and his poor children, he is able to be charitable and appreciative of his boss. The exclamations there show his gratitude, show his understanding of the need to be thankful for what we have, however much or little that is. And as a result, Dickens tells us they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. The Cratchit family might be a representation of poverty, but they are also a representation of family and love. And they understand that love far outweighs material wealth. However, Stave 4 brings us quite a different picture of the Cratchits. Stave 4 brings us the very sad death of Tiny Tim in the future world should Scrooge not change his behaviour. And here Dickens describes the home, saying quiet, very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were still as statues. Now in the previous stave, we'd seen those youngest two Cratchits tearing around the house, full of joy, full of enthusiasm, full of life, full of excitement. And here we see the polar opposite. We see a huge contrast. The simplicity of those first two sentences, quiet, very quiet. They're not even grammatically complete sentences. They're what we call fragments. And perhaps Dickens does that to show the fragmentation of the family now that Tiny Tim has died, to show that this is a family that could feel broken as a result of one of them having died. And it's almost as if there is a removal of life from within the Cratchit family. The youngest two are still as statues. Statues are not living, they're still, they're mournful. They understand the importance of Tiny Tim's loss. And reflecting on Bob's late arrival home, it's reflected, I think he was walked a little slower than he used these last few evenings. We see a very sad image, or we're told of a very sad image of Bob, full of grief, full of upset, full of mourning at the loss of that precious son that he loved and wished to keep by his side. And yet, in spite of all this sadness, Dickens takes us to the room where Tiny Tim's body is laid out. And he tells us the room above was lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. There was a chair set close beside the child, and there were signs of someone having been there lately. In spite of the sadness, the Cratchit family are able to find joy. They are able to celebrate Tiny Tim. They've taken on board that message that Tiny Tim said in stave 3 about the reminder that he gives of Jesus. And they are ensuring that Tiny Tim's body is in a warm, loving environment. People go and sit with him. People go and remember him and love him and honour him. And as a result, Dickens tells us that Bob has become reconciled to what has happened. Just as there was no anger or bitterness at Tiny Tim's illness, there is no angerness or bitterness at Tiny Tim's death. And that shows just how strong Bob Cratchit is, and how much the love and support of this family has allowed for that to happen. And we see that love, we see that support when Mrs. Cratchit kissed him, his daughters kissed him, the two young Cratchits kissed him, and Peter himself shook hands. That verb kissed is repeated 3 times there, again showing the abundance of love and care and affection, and Peter shaking hands there, again showing that respect and that love between the father and son. This love is what allows the Cratchits to endure poverty and hardship. It allows them to understand that the spirit of Tiny Tim was from God. It is declared, "Spirit of Tiny Tim, thy childish essence was from God." They understand that they need to give thanks for the time that they had with Tiny Tim. They need to appreciate, they need to remember with loving hearts. And they need to remember all that Tiny Tim taught them about Jesus and God. And this is something that really strikes a chord with Scrooge, so that by the end of the novel, Scrooge is determined to change his ways and to support the Cratchits, to ensure that their life isn't one that continues in poverty and hardship. So that by stave 5, we see Scrooge giving Bob such a dig in the waistcoat that he staggered back into the tank again. And Scrooge declares, "And therefore I am about to raise your salary." The shock of seeing the Cratchit poverty, the Cratchit hardship, and the realisation that that is something that Scrooge can definitely change, prompts Scrooge to give Bob a raise. And as a result, his family will be able to be better looked after. Perhaps they can move to a house that is better equipped for such a large family. Perhaps they will be able to afford education for their children, better food on the table, warmth, new clothes. And as a result of this declaration from Scrooge, Bob trembled and got a little nearer to the ruler. He had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with it, holding him and calling to the people in the court for help in a strait waistcoat. Bob is so taken aback by this change in Scrooge. Bob is very used to Scrooge, the prison warden, keeping him in his dismal little cell and only letting him have one coal on the fire. But because Cratchit has a heart full of love, he is able to forgive Scrooge for his past actions, to embrace him and to accept his help. So that by the end of the novel, Scrooge is able to endeavour to assist his struggling family. If we think about the purpose of the Cratchits in this novel, Dickens uses this destitute, impoverished family as a contrast to the wealth of Scrooge. At the start of the novel, Scrooge has money, but no loving relationships. The Cratchits have love, but lack adequate funds to live a truly comfortable life. Nevertheless, the Cratchits are happy and grateful for what they have, allowing Dickens to suggest money cannot buy you happiness, love can. The Cratchits embody the spirit of Christmas. They allow Dickens to reinforce the Christian morals that many would argue lie at the heart of this text.